So here you have our title, and if we can go to the next screen, this is based on the work that Peter and I have continued to do in our retirement from the Wellcome Trust funded project that we ran between 2012 and 2018. Many other people were involved in that project, and I'd like to thank them all. They know who they are. I think some of them are attending today, but haven't got time to describe everybody that was involved. What you can see here are the 4 research questions that lay at the heart of that project. I'm not going to read them all out. I will be coming back to some of the kinds of answers to them that we could use a bit later in the talk, but I thought it'd be helpful to people to see what the questions were. The method that we were using to answer these questions, however, is the importance for today, and that is the creation of a data set of all the medical practitioners. You will notice that it covered England, Wales, and Ireland, not Scotland, which in many ways was a very different country medically and so on during the period that we're covering. Today I'm going to be focusing on the evidence that we've collected for England, although I will make a brief mention of Ireland and Wales, but the project covered them as well. So if we could move on to the next screen. So at the top, you will see the website of the project, practitioners.exeter.ac.uk, and one particular page within that, which is the page where we have put on our sample data, and that is what I'm going to be talking about today. And so far, we have put up on that 13 PDF files covering the city and county of Bristol, with some extra material on Bristol after the end of our normal project, because those of you who know me will know that I can't resist knowing things about Bristol and had too much to say in the later period. And then a series of other counties, essentially counties in the south and mostly in the southwest side of England. And those 13 PDF files together at the moment make up 3,860 pages of text available. We are also at an advanced stage, as I said, with putting up a number of other counties, further counties in the Midlands and the west of England, and then most critically of all, Surrey, Middlesex and London. And it should be said that probably the pages for Surrey, Middlesex and London will probably come to almost as much as those for the rest of the country taken together. When we have put those indexes up, registers up, as I hope we shall within the next year or two, then almost all of the southern half of England will be finished apart from East Anglia and Kent. There is already a very good file of material on Kent from the work that Ian Mortimer did on that county, and some excellent material from East Anglia from the original project, which in many ways was the inspiration for this, the work of Margaret Pelling and Charles Webster back at the end of the 1970s. So we've left those counties, but we will be coming back to them. And in addition to the register of practitioners, and the nature of that I'll explain to you in a minute when you see the next screen, but in addition to that, we will also be producing a series of indexes to help people get around the website, indexes of the major categories of practitioner, index of the kinds of entries that have specific types of material in that may be of interest to other researchers. And an important point I should make is that we have a very broad concept of what is a medical practitioner involved in this project. It is essentially anybody who was selling medical services for money. So we are not attempting to look at domestic medicine or medicine provided as charity, because essentially, of course, if we did that, then our biographical index would be of the inhabitants of England, or certainly a very substantial proportion of them. So we're focusing on the people that had an occupation, a practice, as it were, of medicine. But within that, we have taken a very broad definition, not least because one of the things that we're interested in is the overlap, if you like, between medical practice and a whole series of other occupations. Because one of the problems, as Margaret Pelling has long argued with many of the traditional studies of medicine, is that it is assumed, as it were, that there is a well-defined medical profession. and that we know who's in it and who's outside it. That is a very dubious question, and large numbers of people were combining what we might now define as medical with other forms of activity. The most notable examples of this, of course, come in the categories of barber, peruke maker, and barber surgeon, where now we would regard many of the tasks performed by those people as not falling within the area of medicine. But in the early modern period, it's far from clear that that was the case. These forms of care for the body all had significant medical and health implications, and above all, the practitioners of them worked across the boundaries that we would see, not least because it was their skill in the use of sharp instruments, whether it was for shaving or cutting, bleeding, or whatever, and their care and observation of the body and the nature of the skin that lay at the heart of the skills that they had, and those cut across. And we could say the same of other activities as well. So we are trying to capture the broad range, and we're also interested in the changing balance and relationship between those different occupations. It should be said that in our database we have far fewer women than we would like to have. The one distinctively female category, of course, at least until the arrival of the male midwife, is that of the midwife. But even in the area of midwives, I don't feel that we've yet captured as many midwives as we should be able to capture, and we need to pay more attention to that. But of course, many, many other women were involved. There is a good argument to be had, of course, for the inclusion of the concept of nurse as a group in this category, and I'm afraid we dodged that, partly because of the problem of distinguishing between nurses and wet nurses, and partly because people are very often described as nursing, but it is hard to tell whether that, as it were, was a practice or not. So we could perhaps discuss that later. But we have tried to draw a very broad range, although inevitably, of course, what we might see as the core groups, the physician, the surgeon, the apothecary, the barber, and barber surgeon, are by far and away the most recorded, not least because they were the ones that tended to belong to formal occupational groupings and or to be those who were most prominent in society and therefore most likely to have left records. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide. So in this and the next slide, I want to show you what a typical entry from our registers of practitioners for a county look like. And this is an entry for the county of Cornwall that I just picked almost at random. And I just want to talk you through it a little bit. So at the top, you have what are the four common elements in all of our register entries. A name, or very often actually a number of names, because of course one of the great challenges of the early modern period is that people's names very often come up in many variable forms. So we've tried to indicate that. Here we have a death date. We have been arguing and varying, I have to admit, as we've gone on from volume to volume. I'm sure we will clear this up at the end and make it consistent as to whether we also include birth date when we know it, in this case we don't, and what we might call floriat dates, dates at which we believe somebody was practicing. So I think in a future version, this one might actually read floriat 1718, when the first information we have about him, which is that license to practice, we'll see in a moment, up to his known death in 1738. Sometimes, of course, we only have approximate dates. Everybody who appears in the register will be given a person ID, and that will be a way in which, of course, one can cross-refer from people from one place to another. We haven't yet done that for everybody. Then we have the crucial category of occupation. Now, in this case, all the known references to this individual refer to him simply as a surgeon. But in many cases, that occupational category will be more complex because people will be described in different documents as surgeon, barber surgeon, maybe also apothecary and so on, or as if they're a physician, maybe as doctor of medicine, doctor of physic, practitioner in physic, and so on. And one of the things that we want to do is to actually cover as many of those in order to indicate through that heading the range of different variants of titles that may come. And I'll talk a bit more about that and significance of that later. And then we have a location. This case, a relatively simple one, in that all the references we have to this individual place him in Foy in Cornwall. In many cases, of course, we will find people with several different locations, and those will all be indicated. We will choose to put people under a particular county where we think that their major practice took place, but there will also then be cross-referencing to entries in other counties where people have practiced as well. So those are the four, if you like, core pieces of information made available at the top. We then have what we know about this person, and the way that we have chosen to write our entries is essentially in the form of a career biography that is, broadly speaking, in chronological order. What it contains and the length of it will vary enormously. This is what I might call a sort of median kind of entry. Some are very short because we only know one very precise piece of information. Some go on for pages and pages because we know a great deal about the individual and can describe their career in much more detail. In this case, as I say, the first thing that we know about this man is that he was licensed to practice surgery. And medical licensing, as I'll mention later, is a key feature and a key source of information in those dioceses and other church groups where that information has survived. And they're particularly useful because the application, as you can see in this case, was supported by testimonials, which not only give us the names of other practitioners, but also potentially indicate networks of supportive practitioners. And as you'll see, one of our practices is to highlight the names of anybody else who is also going to appear in the register. Hence Chilcot, Seymour, and Winston in this case, and later on Claudius Amyand. In the case of Bennett, or Bonnet, as he may well have been, we have a publication associated with him. Of course, the vast majority of our practitioners did not publish anything, but a significant minority, particularly, of course, of the physicians and to a lesser extent the surgeons, did publish, and as you'll see on the next slide, we indicate those. In his case, he wrote to his fellow surgeon and fellow Huguenot, probably, Claudius Amyand in London, a letter of an interesting case that he'd been involved in childbirth, and that was published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Finally, we had the information about his burial, and we also have information drawn from his will. And information from parish registers and information from wills and inventories, as we shall see, are absolutely core data. So if you could move to the next screen. So we then have four, as it were, types of information that we then provide further for people. So we have tried to indicate what we know about the families of these people, partly because we think that our volumes are actually going to be of enormous interest to family historians and we want to appeal to them, partly because we think it's important to trace the families of our practitioners. And this information, as you can see, is taken from the Foy parish registers. Then, where we know it, we have a record of apprentices. Now, in many parts of England, we have almost no information on whether people took apprentices or not until the early 18th century, when, as in this case, we have evidence drawn from the Inland Revenue records due to the stamp duty that was placed on apprenticeship premiums from the year 1710 onwards. So at that point, suddenly a mass of county apprenticeships outside the main corporate towns that have kept lists of their apprentices becomes available to us. And as it happens, one for Bennett becomes available in 1720. Then I've already mentioned the publication. And then the final category in each entry is the list of references on which the entry is based. We have not footnoted every piece of information in our entries. That would be a massive task and also involve a great deal of repetition, as often one source provides a series of different pieces of information. What we have listed at the bottom of each entry is essentially all the sources that have led to the entry above, put roughly speaking in the order in which they appear in the entry. So we hope that will give people, as it were, enough guidance to be able to follow up if they want to find out more about the individual without creating the massive amount of work that would be involved in going in for a full footnoting process. Okay, if we can go to the next screen now. So the key point I want to talk about now is methodologically why we have chosen to take the shape of mass biographies, individual biographies, and to organize them by county. Right from the beginning of this project, there were always two different routes that we could have taken. And I have to say there was intense debate within our project team, as it were, as to which of these was the best way to organize. The classic database, of course, is organized by individual events or individual pieces of information as contained in a single source. The alternative method, which is the method obviously that we have adopted in the end, is to organize our material by individuals. There are many arguments in favor of one or other approach. And certainly if you're going to be basing a database on specific long-run sources, then there is a very good argument for the event-based model, if you like. It works extremely well in the quantitative analysis of the changing frequency of named occupations in specific long-run sources. One classic example would be that of wills. And a very important body of work was done from this, largely by Patrick Wallace and Justin Colson. We haven't as yet published actually the outcomes of that specifically for medicine, but an extremely important wider outcome about occupational analysis more generally has emerged in the work that Patrick and Justin published, which you'll see in the bibliography on the final page. Another key source, which again Patrick has made huge use of, are apprentice registers, and again tracing over time, as it were, the different frequencies and appearance of different forms of apprentice. And if you're going to adopt that kind of technique, then there's a very good argument, as it were, for having a fixed database with fixed columns and information, as it were, that enable that kind of quantitative analysis. But the problem that we face is that most of the sources which give you some occupational data are not like this. They are much more random sources of different kinds, particularly sources associated with property or other local information that does not have any consistent long-run nature to it. Furthermore, most of the sources that one can potentially draw upon to identify people do not consistently record occupational data, and or the people who calendared, indexed them, or made them available have not consistently encoded occupational data. So that there may be a number of entries that make it clear that Joe Smith was a barber surgeon, but there will also be many other entries for the same Joe Smith that do not contain that information in them. So if we only focus on sources that have consistent occupational data, we will not only miss many references to practitioners, but it will also miss much of the information that we could potentially collect about those practitioners in order to construct career biographies. Because career biographies, or prosopography, to give it the name that is often given to make it sound highly scientific and exciting, require nominal linkage. That is both their challenge, particularly a challenge, of course, in a period where names are so inconsistent in how they're presented. But also, of course, the opportunity, because once you've identified names, and particularly if they're relatively distinctive names, and or when one has several pieces of information, perhaps a wife's name as well as husband's name or whatever, that can enable one to link people together, then that allows one to then, once one has identified that somebody is part of our area of interest from one occupational label, we can then identify other material about them using their names. Okay, next slide, please. But why organize them by county? Well, this, it has to be said, is partly a pragmatic matter. We are probably going to be dealing with somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people by the time this project is over. A single file containing 50 to 100,000 people would be many, many, many thousands of pages long and would be highly unmanageable. So dividing them up by county is partly a way to give us files of manageable size. And it's also a reflection of the fact that we believe that many of the people who will want to use our sources will want location-specific information. They will either be medical historians interested in a particular place, or more likely, they will actually be regional and local historians whose interests lie in a particular place, including, as I say, potentially family historians. And we think that this is going to be a good way of drawing them in. But there are also other arguments other than the pragmatic. And one of them is that organizing by county, and to a lesser extent by town, perhaps within those, reflects the realities both of early modern practice and of varying data sources. Because it is quite clear, I think one of the things one can definitively say about medical careers in this period is that with the precocious exception of London, and with the growing significance of military, maritime, and other forms of overseas practice, overwhelmingly practice in early modern England was local. Even with the groups like the physicians who may have studied and trained elsewhere at university, even if they'd been to Europe, overwhelmingly before the mid-18th century, those people went back to practice in the place where they came from. And that's even more true, of course, of people whose training was through apprenticeship or through family connections. Because at this stage, we're certainly in a period where to win the trust and to know the markets that you were operating in and to take full advantage of your community links, the overwhelming advantage for medical practitioners was to operate in the place where they were brought up, or possibly the place where they had done their apprenticeship. So, although, as I say, we will try to capture people who operated in several different locations and counties, all our evidence would suggest the great majority of people worked in one place, or at least in a series of closely related places, most of which will be within a single county. Now, county boundaries don't always work, and they are, of course, particularly problematic in areas like the Midlands, where anybody who knows the geography of English counties will know that the different counties form a kind of bewildering jigsaw across the middle of the country. And many people will live considerably closer to people who are in neighbouring counties than they will to the other end of the same county. So it doesn't always operate. But as a rough rule of thumb, we can consider counties to be extremely important as a way of capturing a location, an area where people are likely to be practicing, essentially probably within a day's ride, whether it's for the practitioner to go out to people or for people to come in to the market town or community where the practitioner is based. The other major significance is that it reflects the reality that the vast majority of the sources were collected and archived by county, and the question of what survives and can be searched varies hugely by county. as you do this project, you realize how varied not only what was collected and survives in the way of evidence, county by county or possibly diocese by diocese, is, and also from one town to another. You'd think that towns would all have the same kinds of records left, but in fact they don't. It's extraordinary how the variation is. I've explored that systematically for Exeter and Bristol, but it could be said for many other places. They will all have some kinds of records and not others. And there is also a huge variation in what has been indexed, published, and in particular what has been digitized and how this has been done. To take the example of Cornwall, for example, you can't see this from the data set as I had it, but in Cornwall, the family historians have done the most amazing job through something called OPAC, Online Parish Clerks Project, in which they have essentially digitized almost, or digitally indexed almost all the parish records and wonderful sources for occupational data like marriage licenses for that area, which means that it's a wonderful county to study. Many other counties are much more of a nightmare. Either their records are hidden behind the various ancestry and other premium companies, or their records have not been properly indexed at all. So you cannot straightforwardly compare one county with another unless you actually know a great deal about what kind of sources survive to create the kind of registers that we are. And for some counties, we have a massive information, for other counties, much less. Next slide, please. No, I think you went over previous. There, yeah. So that means, as it were, and this is my other sort of go-to methodological point, that what we're dealing with here is not a tight data set. The diversity of the sources that we have available to us mean that it's extremely problematic to say count the number of a different kind of practitioner that we have in multiple places and times. I think I can honestly say that the answer to that question, particularly before the late 17th century, is as likely to be based on varieties in the kinds of sources that survive and whether they have been properly indexed, digitized, or whatever, as it is on anything that is, in inverted commas, really happening out on the ground. And in particular also that because of the plural occupational titles that many people have, relying simply on one source for that is potentially going to be very misleading. If in one place you have apprentice registers and in another place you have probate data, they are going to use different occupational titles for what is essentially the same person, and the results will look very different. And may appear to involve a difference in different places when actually it's a difference in the nature of the sources. And all of these problems are particularly difficult when we're dealing with the earlier periods, particularly the 16th and but to some extent also the early 17th century, when we are dealing with the rural areas or the areas of small towns without corporate records, and also when we are dealing with the less propertied practitioners who are less likely to leave wills or propertied records or appear in these kinds of urban registers. And as I say, the whole world kind of changes in many ways at the end of the 17th century, and particularly in the early 18th century, when we not only have a mass of new kinds of source across the board, but particularly when we have those inland registers and the light that they throw on county apprentices. So my message is partly one of caution, but it's also one of the endless scope that nevertheless there is, I think, for finer grained comparisons within counties, within particular types of source and so on. But also the fact that our entries are essentially a cache, a calendar, as it were, of huge numbers of different document types that people will be able to use and then work on. Case notes, inventories, publications, disputes about practice, and so on. And that leads me on to some brief things that I want to say, as it were, about some of the things that can emerge from the project, if we go to the next slide. And I'm going to just briefly focus on three of them. Now, I apologize, this was meant to be Peter's area of the talk. I'm actually trespassed somewhat on his time because I'm only going to talk in much more general terms than he might have done at this stage about some of the material that he has drawn under these three headings, but I will just talk in very general terms. So if we go to the next slide, the first of these would be longitudinal or chronological studies looking at change over time. And a particular area of interest of this, I think, that obviously our kind of career biographies lay open is the question of medical education or training and how medical practitioners acquired legitimacy. And I've already mentioned the fact that I think that overall in our period, the source of training is perhaps less important to people than how they gained legitimacy and trust in their communities by establishing themselves there. Nevertheless, we can, of course, look at where people were trained. In the case of medical students, those primarily leading towards the study of work as physicians, we can, of course, study those who practiced elsewhere who learned elsewhere in Europe. Our end date of 1715 means that Scotland at this stage is not an important source of medical education, except for the Scots who then came down into England, of course. But other parts of Europe certainly were for the physicians, as well as Oxford and Cambridge. And one of the questions we can look at, of course, because now we know a lot more about the people that are choosing that, is to see how that might relate to where they're coming from, to the nature of their families. But also it's very obvious, as Peter's work is showing, that there are ideological as well as medical choices lying behind that. Most famous, of course, being the choice of nonconformist groups, but also perhaps others, to be educated in the Netherlands by the late 17th, early 18th century, rather than through Oxford and Cambridge. We can look, of course, and I'm not going to talk in any detail here about this, at apprenticeship and guild membership. It's perhaps worth saying a bit more about ecclesiastical licensing, because this, to be honest, seems rather a boring topic, and you might think that licenses were going to be of diminishing significance, particularly as the Church of England loses its monopoly after the Civil War, monopoly in other aspects of religion. But actually it's very clear, and in fact the data for ecclesiastical licensing is actually best for the late 17th and well into the 18th century. And it is very clear, in fact, that gaining an ecclesiastical license, particularly for surgeons, it would seem in many parts of the country, was a very valuable piece of legitimacy that many of them were still seeking well into the 18th century. Even nonconformists, even Quakers, who you might have thought might have kept away from the church court system that the ecclesiastical licensing was part of. And Peter has also shown that in London there is a very complex struggle going on between the attempt of the College of Physicians to control licensing there and those who are licensed by the ecclesiastical authorities, in which, curiously enough, at least at certain points, the ecclesiastical authorities are more likely to license nonconformists than the College of Physicians were. Another thing that emerges is that clearly a growing body of medical men, again particularly physicians, were beginning to specialize and identify themselves with caring for particular forms of disease, for particular groups, such as women and children. Of course, we know that it's in this period specialisms in the eyes, the ears, and the teeth begin to emerge. But there's also clearly a growing body of people specializing in mental health. And again, Peter has done very interesting work building on work by Leonard Smith and others, which shows that this care of the mentally ill seems to have been of particular interest to nonconformists, and one might say that includes Catholics. And it's intriguing to wonder whether this is partly because, as it were, of the kind of spiritual pressures put on their members. And and maybe that they saw themselves as needing to develop a particular set of specialisms. Next slide. We can, of course, also look at changes in the socioeconomic standing of different medical groups. I've already mentioned several times the way in which we can use varying occupational labels to look at the changing balance of individuals who fall in within different areas of medical practice and how those begin to change. Although arguably the most significant development in that occurs slightly after the end of our period, in the mid-18th century period, when we finally see the separation out between between barbers and surgeons, and increasingly barbers becoming lined up with peruke makers and not with surgeons. But also we begin to see perhaps the increasing emergence of the surgeon apothecary and man midwife as Irving Loudon long ago argued, as a kind of precursor of the general practitioner. We can, of course, use all these career biographies to look at the parental background and the family fortunes of different kinds of practitioner and practitioners in different kinds of places. And here there will be a massive information, including, of course, what we know about the occupations of the parents of these people, and we can trace many of those. But also, of course, the evidence of wills and inventories will be particularly informative in terms of indicating the relative wealth of different groups, as well, of course, as containing a mass of very often interesting information, in the case of wills, sometimes about books and instruments, and in inventories, again, books in instruments, shop goods, and so on. The other key developments, I suppose, relate to the relative fortunes of the different professions. One of the most obvious trends that is very clear is the growing number and importance and standing of surgeons. And one of the things that one can start to trace is how this relates to military, maritime, and colonial developments. Although there is a bit of a possible problem here evidentially, which is that by the late 17th century, we have a massive information about, in particular, naval surgeons from the records of the Admiralty and records of privateering and so on, and other central sources, which possibly, as it were, skew the thing. But it's been very interesting to see, for example, how many of the people who are formally speaking citizens and barber surgeons of London are also practicing as naval surgeons, either during or before then taking up their practice on land. Some of them, intriguingly, in fact, seem to be keeping apprentices at the same time as they are at sea, which is an interesting feature. I could equally say, I think, Peter didn't put this on the slide, but I would also say, I think that the role of the apothecary and how this relates to the development of drugs and the commercial trade in medicines, it's also very clear that that is also becoming increasingly important into the late 17th. And I would venture the statement that by the early 18th century, the surgeon and the apothecary have become critical partners in a highly medicalized world, at least in the towns of early modern England. Next slide. We can also do geographical studies, obviously, given my caveat, as it were, about different sources of evidence from different places. This will never be straightforward, but nevertheless, we can look at the growth and spread of medicine across regions, and also at a much more fine-grained level within particular places. The location, for example, of different kinds of medical practitioners within London, where, for example, by the end of the 17th century, it's quite clear that the location of barbers and peruke makers is totally different from the location of the traditional barber surgeon, and probably different from that of some of the apothecaries as well. We can look at in detail and we can map those kind of things. We can look at the impact of maritime and colonial expansion on specific towns, cities and regions. It's very clear that Devon, Hampshire and Kent, for example, were seeing an absolute boom in the number of medical practitioners in the latter part of our period, as was the city of Bristol. And in a place like Bristol, incidentally, by the early 18th century, 8% of all the people being apprenticed in the city were being apprenticed to medical trades. So it is a massive activity. But even all that training of locals wasn't enough. And another clear development that is going on here is the role of immigrants from continental Europe, particularly Protestant immigrants, the Huguenots in the later period, and the immigration of Scots in meeting the demand, particularly the demand in London and the Navy. And again, you can see the influx of new names, Scottish names, surnames and Christian names, as it were, reflecting that in the registers. I could talk, but I won't now, about developments in Ireland as well. We have the opportunity to study that, although it has to be said that what we can say about medical practice in Ireland is almost all about medical practice in Anglo-Ireland. It is extremely difficult to capture what was going on in the predominantly Catholic regions of Ireland. We can also look at the interaction with the colonies, and again, Peter has done a particular study, which he was going to talk about the interaction across the Atlantic with New England during the mid-17th century. Both the significant role of medical practitioners in going out and forming New England, but also how many of them returned during the Civil War period or later, and the crucial role that they seem to have played in the growth of chemical medicine in England in the later 17th century, although immigrants from other parts of Europe and connections with other parts of Europe were also extremely significant in that. Next slide. And then there are what we might call cross-sectional studies, because the other great thing that our mass biographies lend themselves to is for studying the nature of networking, not least because, as it were, we're capturing sources such as the licensing with the sponsorship, or wills with the people to whom people give things and the people who they use as their executors, overseers, and so on, where we begin to see not just individuals, but also connections and groups. There's a great debate been going on in medical history of this period between whether the predominant mode, as it were, of studying medical practice should be that of competition in the marketplace or that of collaboration in various forms of community. And I think we would say that on balance, whilst we can see both, it's the social networks of community and collaboration that perhaps come over most strongly for us. You might say maybe that's the nature of the evidence that we have. Whether it's the formal organizations that people belong to or whether it's networks of support. And again, Peter would choose the example of chemical medicine, where we have both a formal organization that tries to form itself in London in the 1660s, but also particularly it's clear in the licensing process that essentially like-minded practitioners were supporting each other to get these licenses. And we can think about how these networks relate to religious, political, cultural, scientific, and familial networks. And all of those can be open for detailed study. Again, the one that Peter would have talked about, and it reflects the work in the volume that he's just produced, Medicine in an Age of Revolution, OUP 2023, was the particular importance of religion in shaping medical networks, as well as perhaps also in being shaped by them, and the degree to which that involved the politicization of medical practice and practitioners from the time, particularly of the Civil War onwards, although perhaps with Catholics to some extent before as well. And as Peter has shown, this involved a huge influx of medical practitioners into taking up positions of power within local communities as magistrates and other roles in a way that they had not tended to do before the Civil War period. So a very significant development there. Okay, next slide. I am just about to finish. So we are making this data available to all to ask further research questions of it. We will be doing that, but we very much hope that many of you will come in and do so as well. There is a great deal of the sources that we have identified we have not been able to study in detail. We've basically just calendared that they exist. And if I was picking on a single source that I think would revolutionize our understanding of medicine as of many other things, it would actually be all the data contained in the Chancery cases in the National Archives in London. They are essentially the English equivalent of the kind of notarial and other documents that have enabled other historians to study medical practice in such fine detail in other countries. I am convinced that hidden in those chancery case things, incredibly difficult to use as they currently exist, will be a massive information on the finances and mechanics, as it were, of medical practice. There is, of course, the great question of how all this relates to domestic informal medical care and the degree to which the period that we're looking at is a period of distinctive medicalization in the sense of the turning of medicine into a commercial practice on a large scale. There's plenty of evidence that that is happening, but of course the question of how that relates to the domestic and the informal care is important. And finally, of course, particularly to this audience, I think there is great potential to extend our coverage in time and space and to look at comparisons with similar projects and similar work that can be done in other parts of Europe. So the next slide just contains a few references. Maybe we can leave it up, but maybe we should go just to the next slide, just so that I can say thank you.